May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Our readings today focus our attention on the issue of judgment. Judgment that calls for vengeance or forgiveness. Peter asks, how often shall I forgive? Jesus answers 70 times 7. And if you think that Jesus means that it's okay for Peter not to forgive on the 491st offense, you're missing the point of the story. Then quoting Deuteronomy, Paul tells the Romans, never avenge yourselves. That kind of thing then belongs to God. The very judgments that call for either forgiveness or vengeance are reserved for God in the working out of creation. It's not a matter of what we think or how we judge, what we do about it. Matthew says earlier, judge not, so that you won't be judged. That's pretty clear, but it's also kind of tricky, because for many people, moral judgments are the central point in their practice of Christianity. I remember back in high school, before Vatican II, I was dating a Roman Catholic girl in Iowa City, and it was very important for her to go to confession late on Saturday afternoons so that she would be prepared for communion on Sunday. There was a sense that purification was somehow necessary for the sacrament to take effect and express its power. Also meant that Friday night dates were better than Saturday night dates, but that's another story. As far as evangelical churches go, there's a story that when the frontier in the United States began to expand and people moved beyond the mountains to the west, as far as missionary work goes, it says that the Baptists walked, the Methodists rode on horseback, and the Episcopalians waited for the Pullman car to be invented. And that's kind of true. Most of the missionaries that ventured to the frontier were basically Baptist, Methodists preaching a kind of conversion experience. They went and held religious revivals that were focused not so much on theological issues or institutional issues, but on a personal conversion of it, accepting Jesus Christ to be your personal Savior. But those missionaries soon discovered that the bad behavior that had become typical of the frontier, with drunkenness and violence and prostitution and the like, were real impediments to this conversion. And so their primary activity switched to trying to change people's behavior, to teach a stronger moral reform. And that became the main goal of those churches. So much so that being a Christian came to mean acting in a moral way, much more than having certain beliefs. Now, beliefs may not be central, but really neither is morality. Some behaviors certainly get in the way of our relationship with God. But God's grace and love are not dependent on what we do. Our activity doesn't control God's feeling toward us or expression toward us. That's why Jesus opposed the Pharisees. The Pharisees had done the same things that the evangelicals did after the Great Awakening. They focus on behavior. They read the law and discern certain commandments, certain kind of behaviors that put you in favor with God, and stay with that. But that's really only the first step, a preliminary step. And I'm primarily radically with Jesus on this one. I think this is one of the most important things that he said. Judge not so that you not be judged. Judgment is God's job, whether it's vengeance or forgiveness. It's not ours. Now, that's not easy to give up. Judgment is really one of the things that evolved within human society, human behavior, to stay safe in the world. It's looking at that river and judging whether it's safe or dangerous. Looking at that stranger and judging whether it's friend or foe. Carl Jung lists judgment as one of the major faculties that contribute to psychological type. Does someone interact with the world and other people by just observing and perceiving certain facts and details through the senses or some sort of intuition? Or does a person immediately form some kind of judgment when they encounter something else? Is that stranger looks friendly? That river looks dangerously fast. The view from the upstairs window is beautiful. The food tastes good. Judgment is really the first step, somehow, in deciding how we relate with the world outside. Some do it consciously, some do it unconsciously, but everyone has those kinds of judgment. But what Jesus is telling us, what Paul is telling us, is that we have to try to get beyond that, or apply it in very different ways from the ways we do. Whether a view is nice or food tastes good has to do with our preferences. It's not some quality that the view or the food has. In the end, all our judgments say more about us than they do about the situation or the thing or the person that we're judging. And for me, that's really important. We're just called to accept it as it is, to see things as they are and accept them as they are. Every experience that arises in your life, every place that you visit, every sight that you see, every person that you meet, is given by God as a part of your being. You can like it or not. It can be pleasant or not. But the real question is, how do you respond to that encounter? What is appropriate? What is called? Acceptance certainly is an approval. Just because something is what it is doesn't mean that you can't do something to try to change it. But you'll never be able to change it if you deny the reality of what you're dealing with. The perfect example is that you can't deal with the coronavirus if you say it's just gone away. Acceptance isn't forgiveness, though. Acceptance is the first step. Forgiveness is a step beyond acceptance. And that's what the gospel and epistle are talking about. The Greek word used for forgiveness here is aphesis, which means release. And it's used like release from prison, or release from slavery, or release from a debt, such as we had in the story, in the parable, in the gospel reading. That it's a letting go of whatever you're releasing. Now, in one sense, forgiveness, as I said, is really something God does. God judges, God follows up with consequences of forgiveness or vengeance sometimes. But that's really not our call. What forgiveness, in a way, I think, is for us is when we release someone from their enmeshment with us. God deals with the consequences of behavior. But when you or I or Peter feel that someone has sinned against us, what we're saying is we think we're saying that person is bad or that thing is bad. But what we're saying is that this action of another person hurt me. And what we're called to do, rather than sort of blame the start of that hurt on someone else, we need to look where that hurt comes from in ourselves, and again, decide how we're called to respond. We have to accept the condition as it is, accept the situation as it is, but beyond that, we can only respond well if we disentangle ourselves from that. If we're feeling sinned against or put upon or hurt in some way, it's like our lives are all entangled. It's like trying to multiple knots that you've got in your shoelace or in something you're tying, and you have to carefully undo all that. I think that's a good way to think about forgiveness on a personal level. We're not saying a person's actions are good or okay. What we're saying is that we should not take this personally. That no one can get me angry. No one can drive me crazy. Those are things that I do in reaction to other things. And if I can disentangle myself from that situation, then even my hurt, even my fear, recognized as something that's in my life, becomes another opportunity to respond, becomes another really gift from God in a way. So acceptance and forgiveness are the reactions, the responses to experience that Peter's talking about, that Paul is talking about when someone sins against us or we feel put upon by something. But as I've said before, those are only the first two steps in a process. The step after forgiveness is gratitude. And in some way, gratitude reties what we just untied with forgiveness. It doesn't get re-enmeshed, but it begins to understand the connections that we have to whatever is the source of our feeling. The person who has hurt us, the situation that we find ourselves in. How does it connect to our life? How are we called to respond to that? With forgiveness, we acknowledge the separation from a tangled relationship. And with gratitude, we can see how these encounters bring us into relationship. And all our life, as I've said before, is relationship. It's just that we have to see it clearly in this way, with acceptance and forgiveness and gratitude. One of my favorite quotes is from Brother David Stendhal-Rost, who's a German Benedictine or Austrian Benedictine spiritual teacher who points out that if most of life is simply given, then we should treat it as a gift. I think that's true. And it makes a difference in how we live our lives. For Christians, though, I think there's another step beyond that. And that involves an awareness that the one who sins against me, the situation that is feeling like it's harming me, are inseparable parts, along with my life, in a larger whole. We do not live to ourselves or die to ourselves, Paul says. If we live unto the Lord. If we die unto the Lord. Elsewhere, he says, we have already died, and our life is hidden with Christ in God. So that fourth step is the step that opens to Christian love, where we realize that everyone and everything is in that relationship. I can't be me without you being you. And it's in that love that we find God, because God is love. So if someone sins against you, and you get irritated, if life gets really hard, like say there's a pandemic, or maybe there's forest fires raging all around, turning the sky orange. Or speaking of orange, there's political upheaval and near social chaos. Try to remember acceptance, forgiveness, gratitude, and love. If we can do that, then as Hildegard of Bingen says, all will be well. All manner of things will be well. Thanks be to God.